It's helpful sometimes for us to think about our relationship with God as if it were a marriage. Actually, the metaphor of marriage is used quite often in scriptures. And Christ is described as a bridegroom. We have the wedding banquet described in Revelation. We quite often think of banquets that we might have with God. And in places, the church is described or alluded to as the bride of Christ. Our readings during this week have focused on the covenant that God has made with his people. And the beginning of our collect for this week speaks to that as well. Just let me read the opening lines of this week's collect. God of Sarah and Abraham, long ago you embraced your people in covenant and promised them your blessing. And a covenant is a contract. It's very much like a marriage contract that draws two people together and locks them into, ties them into, binds them together into a fellowship or an agreement or a connection, a marriage. And so it is helpful for us sometimes to think about our relationship with God as a marriage. And we can imagine all the best of what marriage has to offer as we think about our relationship with God. We think about the sense of security, of intimacy, of closeness, of understanding and being understood, of someone who is unconditionally in love with us and someone whom we love unconditionally. These in many ways characterize our relationship with God. And so thinking about our relationship with God, not only as a friendship and not only as a created relationship, but also as a marriage, is a useful thing for us to do, and it may deepen our relationship with God. But our reading for today from Jeremiah chapter 3 presents, unfortunately, the opposite of that, which we know happening in many marriages and perhaps even in your own. And that is that marriages sometimes fail. And quite often marriages fail because somebody is unfaithful. Somebody commits adultery. And we get this metaphor of the people of God as adulterous spouses in scriptures as well. So let me read you a few verses from Jeremiah chapter 3. I'm going to read verses 6 to 8, where God speaks to the people of Israel and the people of Judah. And so Jeremiah writes, "During the reign of King Josiah, the Lord said to me, 'Have you seen what faithless Israel has done? She has gone up on every hill and under every spreading tree, and has committed adultery there. I thought that after she had done all this, she would return to me, but she did not. And her unfaithful sister Judah saw it. I gave faithless Israel her certificate of divorce and sent her away because of all her adulteries. Yet I saw that her unfaithful sister Judah had no fear. She also went out and committed adultery.'" Well, God here is speaking about the people with whom he has made this covenant that goes back to Abraham, and even before to Noah, this covenant which we spoke about on Sunday during our church service. And they have broken this covenant. And the metaphor that God uses in this passage in his communication with the people of Israel is that they have committed adultery. And in the context here, it really sounds as if the adultery that they've committed is about idolatry, and that they were worshipping other idols. And in a sense, what he says is that you were supposed to be faithful to me. This is the marriage that we have entered into, and yet you are sleeping with these other idols. You have ignored me, and you have hooked up with these idols, these other gods. He's saying that the people of God have cheated on him. And so I invite us to think about our own sin. When we sin, when you sin and when I sin, that we think about that as not just sin, but as adultery. Let's frame it for what it is. Instead of turning to God to have our needs met, we turn to other things to meet our needs. And I'm not just talking about sexual adultery or sexual issues. I'm really talking about all of sin. And since all of sin involves us seeking to meet our deepest needs in some way other than God, rather than turning to God to have those needs met. And that is quintessentially what adultery is. Instead of turning to one's partner to have your needs met, you go out of the marriage and you find another partner, somebody out there, to meet your needs. So sin is when we take something else and put it in the place of God. God also speaks here about pretense. He says in verse 10, he says, in spite of all of this, her unfaithful sister Judah did not return to me with all her heart, but only in pretense. So she came back, but not with a full open heart, but with things that are hidden. And in marriage counseling, we see this quite often, that when when there's been adultery in a marital relationship, the guilty party, the party who went outside of the marriage, sometimes comes back but is not fully committed, really just pretending. It looks like they've come back, but actually they're just pretending. And God calls the people of Israel out on this. He says, I can see that you're not sincere, that you're not genuine in returning to me. It's just a pretense. And because of that, God issues a decree of divorce. In verse 8, God says, I gave faithless Israel her certificate of divorce and sent her away. Now, dear friends, in our relationship with God, that is the very last thing that any of us would want, isn't that so? The very last thing that we would want is that our sin is so persistent, or that our returning to God is so full of pretense and insincerity that God issues a divorce and sends us away. It would be terrible. The good news is that God is the kind of husband who has an almost unlimited capacity. I say almost unlimited, perhaps it is unlimited capacity to forgive and to welcome us back. And so he does, in fact, call Israel back. And listen to what he says in verse 11. The Lord said to me, that's to Jeremiah, faithless Israel is more righteous than unfaithful Judah. Go proclaim this message towards the north. Return, faithless Israel, declares the Lord. I will frown on you no longer, for I am faithful, declares the Lord. I will not be angry forever. Only acknowledge your guilt. You have rebelled against the Lord your God. You have scattered your favors on foreign gods under every spreading tree and have not obeyed me, declares the Lord. Return, faithful people, declares the Lord, for I am your husband. I will choose you. Isn't that amazing? Isn't it amazing that God has a capacity to reconcile with us even when we commit adultery against him, even when we leave him, even when we return to him with pretense and not with full-hearted sincerity? He still receives us. He forgives and he reconciles. We get a similar kind of narrative from the prophet Hosea. And in the story of Hosea, God instructs Hosea to actually go and marry an adulterous and promiscuous wife. He sets out to marry a woman who has already been committing adultery and who is promiscuous. And of course, things don't go well. But at the beginning of chapter 3, God instructs Hosea to reconcile with her. And he writes this, the Lord said to me, go, show your love to your wife again, even though she is loved by another man, even though she is an adulteress. Love her as the Lord loves the Israelites, even though they turn to other gods. and love the sacred raisin cakes. So I bought her for 15 shekels of silver and about a homer and a lethek of barley. And then I said to her, "You are to live with me for many days. You must not be a prostitute or be intimate with any man, and I will behave the same way toward you." And so in this metaphor, allegory of Hosea's marriage, which we think was probably not a real marriage, but a story about God's relationship with Israel, Israel is invited to come back into the marriage with Hosea, back into the marriage with God, despite everything that she had done. God is not naive. He knows everything that you and I have done. But he invites us back, and he urges us to remain faithful to him. And then he promises that he will be faithful to us. It's a covenant. It's mutual. It's two-sided. It is equal in its commitment to each other. So, dear friends, as we continue our journey through Lent, as we continue to fast, as we continue to reflect critically and thoughtfully on our relationship with God and particularly on our sin, let us renew our marriage vows with God. Let us renew them. Let us enter again into the covenant that he has already made with us. And let us be faithful. Let us love him. Let us be monogamous. And let us enjoy his blessing. Amen.